nothing else. Just us. And the cameras. And those wonderful people out there in the dark.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to a new podcast. That's exactly what we need in this world right now is another podcast by just like two randos. But anyway, welcome to our podcast Out There in the Dark. Tom, do you know what that is a reference to?
Yes, I do, Azed. It is a reference to Sunset Boulevard.
Yes, indeed.
One of the greats.
Norma Desmond at the end says, those wonderful people out there in the dark. So that's where we got the name. For those people who are taking bets. Anyway, I am Azed Majid, and with me is Tom Alexander. We're two guys in the film industry here in Toronto in various capacities.
Right.
Tom is the VP of theatrical releasing for Mongrel Media, which is great distribution company. And I'm like sort of a jack of all trades kind of.
You do it all, man.
I do it all. I produce,
Director,
I write,
producer,
direct.
writer.
Yes. And all very badly.
No.
So,
stop it.
yeah, we decided we wanted to do a podcast basically because we're both real film nerds. And when we say film nerds, can we define film nerds? Because film nerds can sound like somebody who's really into like, John Hughes movies, right?
Yeah,
I'm not saying I'm not, but
I am not.
Yeah, I'm
but
not either.
No, I think as a film nerd, we're into cinema as a overall obsession.
Yeah.
It sort of echoes in every part of our daily lives. I work in the film industry on a daily basis, and when I'm not working, I'm watching movies. Right. I'm talking about movies, or I'm writing about movies, and it's I never get sick of it, and I've been doing this my whole life.
Exactly. That's well put, Tom.
Yeah.
So yeah, really, really big film nerds here, and we love, all about the history of cinema and what cinema actually means, in terms of its relation to culture. And so let's do a podcast. This is what we said. Yeah. And we are doing our inaugural episode here on a really controversial, I think, and fascinating development in the world of cinema, which is
capital C cinema,
exactly. Which is, I'm gonna pass it to Tom to explain the Sight and Sound poll. But Sight and Sound is a magazine, a British magazine, a film magazine that goes way back to like what, the 60s or 50s even.
Earlier
goes back, and they've been doing for a long time. They've been doing these. Like every decade, they do a poll, and I'm going to let Tom take it from there, but it's basically a poll of the greatest films of all time. Now, you explain to those wonderful people out there in the dark.
All those people out there in the dark.
You explain to them how the poll works.
So, ever since the first poll that Sight and Sound magazine did was in 1952, and they poll worldwide film critics, film industry professionals, film festival programmers, journalists, to give their top 10 films of all time. They're given no direction as to how to do this. Are these your 10 favorite films? Are these your 10 films you think are the most influential? It's up to the actual person submitting those 10 films to decide how they want to do it. And then about 20 years ago or so, they started also doing a separate poll of directors. So now Sight and Sound magazine, every 10 years, from 1952 forward, have done this poll. And the first time they did it in 1952, the winner was Bicycle Thieves. For the next few decades after that, it was Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
So that would have been in 62, 72, 82, 92, and 02. And then in 2012... another film came on the top of the list, which was Hitchcock's Vertigo.
Vertigo, yeah.
And then in 2022, the winner was Chantal Akerman's 1975 3.5-hour feminist masterpiece, Jeanne Dielman.
Right. Yes, so that's what we're here. Very well done, by the way, Tom. I was fascinated the whole way through. No, and that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about Jeanne Dielman, which the full title is actually the address and everything, but I'm not going to even attempt it. This is a strange. I mean, this is what we were talking about. That okay? Most people have seen Citizen Kane. Even if you're not a huge movie lover, you've come across it, right? I think a lot of people have seen Vertigo, whether they like it or not, and at least have heard of these movies, right? Yeah. And the other movies in the top 10, most of them I'm sure people have heard of, maybe not like Man with the Movie Camera or whatever, but Kubrick and
there would be quite a few. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Singing in the Rain, but there are other films in the top 10 that might be a little bit more obscure for even the
the more casual film
Beau
buff.
Travail by Claire Denis, for example, or Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love.
Right. So I mean, I think there are a few, but even those movies, to me anyway, they're like, they're not they're more art house films. But Jeanne Dielman is very different because it's an avant-garde movie. It's really a kind of, it comes out of the experimental cinema movement, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And, you could say that the other movie that is in the top 10, which is kind of similar in some ways, is maybe, again, Dziga Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera,
which is a documentary.
Yeah, which is like an essay documentary kind of thing, and that's from like what? That's from like
1929.
29, right? So, it's but this is a different kind of movie. It's so. I was just shocked that it was like like it's now considered the greatest film of all time, and
everybody was shocked.
Yeah.
Right. It made headlines. I mean, it made a big headlines. Deal.
Yeah. And I've talked to people and they're like, oh yeah, okay, I'm gonna. And this was the thing. I was like, well, it's a strange choice only because again, it's not an accessible film in any sense. Like where it's not streaming on Netflix, right? I mean, you're never going to see it on a conventional streaming service. It's in French. Well, yeah, it's in French, and it's basically. Well, why don't you tell us, Tom, the basic storyline and structure of Jeanne Dielman?
Jeanne Dielman is around 3.5 hours long, and it centers on a woman played by Delphine Seyrig, who is a single mother and housewife, although her husband has passed away. And the entire film is her doing domestic stuff around the house. She's
like
cooking
in a very
dinner.
Ritualized way.
She's cooking dinner. She's having a bath. She's peeling potatoes. She's serving dinner for her teenage son. And the film style is extremely ritualized and structured so that it's almost obsessive compulsive the way her behavior is. As she moves from room to room, for example, she always shuts off the light when she leaves and always turns on the light when she enters. She's always done up just so. And the way the film works is that over the 3.5 hour running time, we learn that the other thing that she does, besides her chores around the house, the apartment, is she's a part-time prostitute. And so the film takes place over 3 days, and she sees a different client each day. And as the film progresses, things start to get a little bit unhinged, bit by bit by bit by bit.
Right.
And without giving too much away, it because of the slow pace of the film, which really inaugurated a style of avant-garde cinema known as the slow cinema movement. Mm-hmm. It leads to an ending that is quite simply shattering.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's basically it. And the thing is, like, it's hard to convince a person who isn't into movies like on this level.
It's what we distributors like to call a tough sell.
Right. Right. That's a great way of putting it, Tom. If Chantal Akerman had come to Mongrel today with this movie, you would turn her away, wouldn't you?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
That is a really, really good question.
I wonder.
I wonder too. Or would we have turned it away in 1975, which is when the film was made? I think it's important to note too that Akerman was only 25 years old when she made the film.
That's insane.
And it was not her first film. Like, for example, Orson Welles, who was 24 when he made Citizen Kane, and that was his first film. But it is pretty insane when you consider how measured and highly mature the themes and the style of the filmmaking are. In today's Hollywood, a 24-year-old or a 25-year-old, the best they could probably come up with is maybe like one of the Ant-Man sequels or something. So,
right.
If that.
Yeah, if that, exactly. That's not even that bad of a movie. No, but I totally agree. Like, it's pretty shocking. I've seen other Chantal Akerman films as well. Not that many, but like she did one called Je tu il elle, which was like, way ahead of its time in terms of its concepts of gender. Where we're at today, that movie was at that point in the 70s, right? She was a very, very, like, this is the thing I was getting at. It's like, it's really hard to convince people to watch this movie who aren't, PhDs in cinema, right? But it's because it's so daunting, the description. But I think you'll agree with me, because we went to see it together. I had seen it once before, but me and you went to go see it. It just played at Lightbox.
And
right?
I had never seen it before. And I think to your point, Azed, is that I'm a big movie buff, and I've seen a lot of movies, and I had never seen Jeanne Dielman before. Of course, I'd heard of it and knew its reputation, but I had never seen it until it showed up at the top of the Sight and Sound poll, and I said, oh, well, geez, I gotta see this movie.
Right.
Why haven't I yet? And you know what I did? I went through the list, and I looked at some of the new entries on the critics list, and I looked at the ones that I had not seen, and almost all of them were by female directors. And I was really ashamed.
Yeah.
I was really, really ashamed because I had never seen Beau Travail. I've still never seen... it's a number of Agnes Varda films I have not seen. I've never seen Wanda by Barbara Loden.
Right.
So, I mean... And of course, there's other films I hadn't seen yet either. So it was a real wake-up call and helped me kind of understand... because we're going to talk about this. Why is this film the number one on the Sight and Sound poll?
Right.
Does that actually mean that it's the greatest film ever made?
Yes, good point. Right.
Or does it mean something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, it's interesting. We'll get into this in more detail, but that thing you were talking about these movies by, female directors and, your sense of shame, at the same time, it's like, the industry just wasn't pushing them, right? It's like they were obscure even by like crazy people like us standards, right? Like, where were we going to go find a copy of Jeanne Dielman before this year, and if we didn't have the internet? You know what I mean? Well, the only place I can think in Canada that you can really watch it is you can subscribe to the Criterion channel. Yeah. Which is the Criterion Collection. The DVD Blu-ray label has their own streaming service. Right.
So they carry the Blu-ray for Jeanne Dielman. You can watch it on their service, or you can buy their Blu-ray. But you can't find it on Netflix.
No.
It's not going to be playing at the local Cineplex. It's not on the bottom half of a double bill somewhere.
Right.
It's 3.5 hours long.
Right.
So we were lucky enough to see it with the cinematographer in attendance, which was quite remarkable. Yeah,
she was amazing.
And they screened it in a 35 millimeter print, which was wonderful to see on the big screen.
It was. And this is the thing, like, I'm gonna say right now, first of all, I love this movie. I think it's fucking amazing, right? And I say that because and the thing is, like, yes, of course I like a lot of art films and experimental films, and I'm into movies, but there's been a lot of movies I've seen that are like considered great, whatever, but if they're too experimental, I'm not gonna. I can definitely get turned off by that stuff easily, because it can just seem kind of artsy and pretentious, right? But not this one. This one, as bad as it's it's a log line might be. I mean, it's a mesmerizing film, and it defies, in many ways, it sort of defies logic for me, because it shouldn't be this hypnotic and mesmerizing, considering your description, but it really is. It really. I never found myself bored,
No.
and I've seen it twice. And the thing is, like, even though I knew what was coming, it's fascinating on many different levels. So this is something. I mean, I'm interested to know your take on it too. I know you really liked it as well,
Yeah.
right? But do you agree with me that, like, she's tapped into some weird?
I couldn't agree with you more,
Yeah.
and I still think about the film probably every day since I saw it for the first time, because it is such a singular experience, and experience is the only way to say it. And I don't mean to sound, full of hyperbole or anything, but because of its slow pace, its long takes, I think what makes it extremely powerful, and probably even more powerful for a first-time viewer in 1975, is it is probably the first major film where you're just seeing somebody do the day-to-day things that we all do every day. In most films, there's a plot and story and characters that do all sorts of dramatic things, and there's a lot of drama in Jeanne Dielman, but it all comes from the day-to-day life of making dinner, cleaning the kitchen, dusting the living room. And there's a cumulative effect when you watch the film where you're watching it and you're thinking about what you're watching, and it's the same thing, and then you start thinking about how you're thinking about it, and then little subtle changes start happening in the routines. The film is very much about routine and how we become hypnotized by these routines, and so that when things start to change, we start to break.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, there is as I said earlier, there's almost a ritualistic quality. We talked about this a little bit after the screening, that almost borders on the sacred. And I think I was thinking about this as well, that one of the filmmakers that this movie reminds me of is like movies by Robert Bresson, who was also very not a lot of camera movement, very, very strict, formal, formally does the kind of same thing, and it's like it's what he doesn't show, and there's that doubling of the voiceover showing you exactly the same thing, and it's like, well, I can see that. Why are you doubling it? There's a formalism there that points to something, as the phrase goes, the transcendental, right?
Right.
By famous book by Paul Schrader, Transcendental Style in Cinema, where he talks about Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer, three great filmmakers. I'm sure we'll be talking about them in future episodes. But did you see the same thing that I'm seeing? Like there's definitely a kind of Ozu, Bresson quality to Jeanne Dielman as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's sort of a different kind of transcendental cinema.
It is.
Than you would get from either of those three. They're very they're mostly based on gender. I mean, I think the point of view of Akerman is completely different from that of Bresson, Ozu, or Dreyer, where she is looking at the specific female role singularly in this environment of this kind of not run down apartment, but it's modest. It's modest.
It's very clean though. Very fucking clean. I was like, holy shit, this woman is clean.
It's very clean until it's not clean.
Yeah. Until it's not clean. Ooh, exactly.
Then the chills start running up your spine.
Yeah.
So I think there's something else going on with Akerman's film that is not going on in most of the films from the other filmmakers we talked about there. The other interesting thing about Jeanne Dielman, and this is not something that I see written about it a lot because I have been reading up on it where I can, is the role that her teenage son plays. And it is a very strange dynamic between the two of them. So because she's widowed, and she has this seemingly obsessive compulsive need to continue cleaning and doing the exact same things every single day. And he seems to both be a part of that obsessive routine, and in a very almost perverted way fighting against it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the conversations that he does initiate with her, the conversations she initiates with him tend to be, how's your day at school?
Yeah, very banal.
Very banal.
Right.
Where he keeps asking about,
the dead father, like about sex.
About their sex life.
Yeah, right.
Their sex life between her and his father.
Right.
Sex at school with other teenagers and talking about sex.
Right.
And it becomes an almost Oedipal kind of situation that doesn't feel natural and makes you wonder a couple of things. What made me wonder was how much does he know about what else she does during the day?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's really fascinating because the son is, you can easily overlook the son in some weird way, like if you just she has a son, right? Mm-hmm. But you're right. There's he definitely seems to play a role in kind of puncturing because look, I mean, one way of reading the film is that Jeanne Dielman is basically highly ritualized in her activities because it allows her to stay completely distracted, completely alienated from her feelings, right? Because you can imagine that the life that's being shown here of the typical, if you want to in quotes, housewife, is one of repressed rage, that
Mm-hmm.
that and her relationship to her son is almost like a holdover of her relationship you can imagine with her husband, where she's serving the male, right?
Right. The teenager does nothing in the house except be waited on. He comes in. She's measuring him for a sweater, I think, and she's cooking him dinner, and he's reading. It seems, just every night he's tries to read a book at the dinner table, and every night she says, "Don't read at the table."
That's even part of the ritual.
That's part of the ritual too, and it's pretty messed up. And when you see it start to crack, there's a point in the film where after she visits, I think it's when she's with her second client on the second day, when she comes out of the bedroom.
It's 3 days.
3 days, 3 clients.
Right.
Her hair's messy. Suddenly, she forgets to turn the light on in the hall when he pays her, and then she starts forgetting other little things.
Doesn't she burn the potatoes that day too?
I think so. She puts the money in the soup dish,
but she doesn't cover it.
But she forgets to cover it.
Which is, I know, that is brilliant about this movie, because the littlest details that you would never think about in another movie become these extremely foreboding, kind of like dramatic.
She's drying the silverware. She drops a spoon, and it's a jump scare.
It is. It's true. That's what I'm saying. There's a real magic to the movie. It just sucks you in. And when the son is the one who actually says your hair looks like it looks really messy, right?
Yeah.
And even that was a bit like, hey, what the hell's happening, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's brilliant, is that it's sort of like over these 3 days. The first day you're given the full duration of that timing of her ritual, so that you're used to it. Then you as the audience, you start to pick up on it right away, right? Because you have been through that routine already. And now you've seen this person who's perfect, getting everything perfectly right. And then it starts to break down. Now, it's interesting. I think what you're saying, and I agree with you, is that on the second day of the second client, now you've never gone into that room so far. Like the first client, she shuts the door. The shot is from, very far away in the hallway. You see the door close,
and it's beautifully done. You get the passage of time. Not from a dissolve or from a clock. It's just the light changes. Yeah, and it's a hard cut. It's later in the afternoon.
Yeah,
it's a hard cut. Yeah.
Yeah, and she does that on the second day too, but her hair is messy, all that stuff, right? So
something's off.
Something's off, and you haven't seen it. By the time you see the third, you're in the room with her, with the client, and I think that speaks to what we are both talking about with why things start to fall apart, right? Because it's clear that these clients are kind of getting to... This one client seemed to have gotten to her,
Yeah.
Had sort of gotten past the defenses, right? To use the the loaded term, penetrated, right?
Right.
And that's what initiates the breakdown, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of her rituals, right?
And none of this would be perceptible were it not for the running time of the film.
Exactly. It
It
has
is
to be like that.
absolutely
Yeah.
necessary to be as long as it is because watching the movie, it becomes an experience, because you are literally experientially within this apartment with her, and you're watching her do all of these things in real time, and it's only by watching them happen in real time that you notice the next time that things are a little bit different.
Yeah.
And it's only by that method that you start to feel uneasy. You start to feel as unsettled as she is.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it become shattering. And I think on the second day, she's making meatloaf,
Yeah.
and it's the most. I was on the edge of my seat.
Yeah.
And I don't know why.
I know.
The
And
look
also,
in her face, it was not obvious. She just walked. There was just something going on that you are riveted. In 3.5 hours, I only looked at my watch twice.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And
I've seen 90-minute movies where I look at my watch 8 times.
yeah. That's most movies these days. Yeah. I mean, it's so true. Like the interesting thing for me is also the two things: the sound, which is almost like a Jacques Tati film, right? It's very almost slightly overdone, right? Like you hear the squishiness of the meat,
Yeah, that's true.
and like the
Yeah.
pots and pans, everything's a little heightened, right?
When she drops that spoon, it's
Yeah.
like it's like ear splitting.
Yeah,
somehow.
because that's the only sound that's like it's funny because like there are a couple of times where there's one point where because things go off, her timing is off and she has to kind of wait. Remember, she goes into the living room, she just sits there.
Yeah.
And so it's like she has no improvised moments, right? Where she can just watch some TV or whatever. It's like if she's off schedule, she just has to sit there and kind of wait for the time to catch up,
And you're waiting there with her.
and you're waiting there with her and you're going, well, what does she do? But that's also very creepy. Like it starts to make you feel so uneasy because like, why doesn't she just do something, right? But anyway, all to say, like, I would really encourage people, even if you're not a big, movie fanatic, to watch this movie because I think it's important. Now, whether or not it belongs as the number one greatest, like it's now considered the greatest film of all time. Let's talk about that a little bit because I have both a lot of admiration for that and also some skepticism, right? Yeah.
I would. I'm going to lead with the admiration theme because I think it's a really, really important film, probably more influential than we might consider. It seems to exist, in and of itself outside of most movies because it is so avant-garde. It is so different from anything you've seen. And, Akerman has stated that she was influenced primarily by experimental filmmakers, avant-garde filmmakers, like Michael Snow and people like that. But, when I think of some of the art house movies that I've not only seen but have worked on, where I can see echoes of Jeanne Dielman going through.
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of, we had a film called A Ghost Story by David Lowery.
Love that movie.
Yeah. And do you remember the scene where Rooney Mara is sitting in the house after Casey Affleck dies, and she eats a pie? And she sits down on the floor with a pie.
Yeah.
And she, in one shot, she eats the
whole thing.
entire pie.
Yeah. That's true. I never made that connection, but yeah.
That strikes me as she's very much part of this house.
Yeah.
A pie is a very homey, warm, comfortable thing.
Yeah.
And she takes something that should be comforting to her grief.
Right.
And turns it into some kind of monstrous.
It's grotesque almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, I also think about, I said earlier that Jeanne Dielman seems to be a film where not much happens. And in most cinema, things happen.
Right.
right? And then I started thinking about, well, what kind of films where things don't happen, but they seem to mean a lot,
Right.
you know? And I thought about Seinfeld. Now, I don't know if Larry David or Jerry Seinfeld ever saw Jeanne
Right.
Dielman,
They were big on it. Yeah.
but they made a show about nothing,
Right.
which was really about so many things.
That's an interesting point.
And
Yeah.
it started to occur to me that, you know, since Jeanne Dielman, there's been so much more media where we're just rooted in our day-to-day lives. And sure, I know you had filmmakers like Ozu, who worked on, you know, whose subject matter was very much of the domestic,
Yeah.
you know, relationships between family members.
Right.
And that there's also a history of film movements such as Italian neorealism,
Right.
or the so-called angry young man films of Britain
Of
from
60s,
the 1960s,
yeah, right.
you know, the kitchen sink dramas.
Right.
But really, when you're looking at taking meaning from really minuscule day-to-day lives, I think that's a real legacy that we all live with in different kinds of films and television, that I think we can look back on something like Jeanne Dielman and say, okay, well, that's, you know, that had a part of that.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with that too. Like, you're right. I think it's a movie that, it's interesting. I only read about the film when I was at film school.
Yeah, me too.
You know, because I was very heavy on theory when I was in school, which everybody hated me for. But anyway, you know, people who are in production never are like, what the fuck are you taking theory for, right? But I read a lot of theory, and I would read about this movie all the time, you know, in academic circles. And I think well, the truth is, now that I've seen it a couple of times, it's like, you're right. The influence has been felt, but the movie itself was never really known.
No.
And I think that's interesting, because it's a story of female artists going way back, right?
Right.
You know, they were not allowed in the academy. You know, I think that's just, it's sad to contemplate how many works of real genius have never seen the light of day, or at least haven't been properly seen, all because they were done by women, and they weren't allowed to be in the canon, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
now if you look at the Sight and Sound poll of the top 100 films, you know, there's so many more female directors,
Right.
you know, and you know, and back when you and I, Azed, went to film school,
Yeah.
I mean, the canon that we were taught
Yeah.
was so male-centered, was so,
All.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was all old Hollywood, John Ford, Orson Welles,
Yep.
Hitchcock,
Hawks.
Howard Hawks.
Yeah.
These are all uber macho directors.
Yeah.
Great filmmakers,
Great.
of course.
Great filmmakers.
But you know, I think, so keep in mind that when Sight and Sound, every year, they've expanded the number of requests they send out
Right.
for
And
top 10 lists.
gone more international. right?
More international. You know, one thing I read was that in 1952, when Bicycle Thieves topped the list as number one, and keep in mind, that was a film that was only 4 years old at
Yeah,
the time.
it was fairly new.
So it was fairly
Yeah.
new.
Yeah.
It was Citizen Kane had already come out beforehand, back
Right.
in 1941.
Right.
But because of World War II, not a lot of Europeans saw Citizen Kane.
Right.
So there's a lot of thought that wondering if, had more Europeans saw Citizen Kane back then, would
Right.
Citizen Kane been on the top of the 1952 poll?
That's an interesting thing to contemplate.
Right.
Although, I mean, look, it's beyond like awful for me to even say this, but I like Citizen Kane, right? Like, you know, like how much more banal can you get than that? But like, it's true. Like Citizen Kane, I can watch anytime.
And you know what's funny is that, and I think I would say this about Jeanne Dielman as well. Both Citizen Kane and Jeanne Dielman are more entertaining than you would think. I think a lot of people might
Yeah.
think Citizen Kane is like homework.
It's like work, yeah.
Greatest film ever made, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. You know, no thank you. But it's a lot of fun. It's very funny. It's very breezy.
The performances are so great. They're
it's
so
a
theatrical, and the shots and the lighting and all that stuff,
Jeanne
right?
Dielman's not a blast, but there are moments of humor. There are parts that are genuinely kind of come out of left field that are funny. mostly around the teenage son.
Yeah.
But and there are parts that are nerve-wracking.
Yeah, I think it's more like I would. So one of the things about us and the way we watch movies, at least for me, I know this is probably true of you too, but we're so into movies that we dissect movies. Even while I can do this simultaneously while I enjoy a movie, right? It's not like, oh, just sit back and enjoy it. Part of the fun for me is I can still be immersed in the movie and totally I can cry, everything, right? But still be kind of on another part of my brain, just kind of like noticing all the things that the reads I'm thinking about, or the way the it's interesting, the camera.
People who say to me, "Oh, why don't you just sit back and enjoy it for once?" It's like, screw you.
It's like, this is the way
this is the enjoyment.
I know. It's like,
this is why I can't sit and just watch the Avengers every day. Like, come on.
I know. I was this happened to me. This is a little sidebar. I had to, for some reason, I had to watch. it involved a child, right? So I had to watch a movie, a Star Wars movie from the 70s.
That would be Star Wars.
Yeah, Empire Strikes Back. No. The other one after that.
Return of the Jedi?
Return of the Jedi, right.
Oh, jeez.
And I thought, okay, this is going to be fine. I hadn't seen it in like 50 years or whatever, but I was like, okay, I'll just watch it. I'm sure it'll be fun. It was fucking brutal. I could barely keep it together.
It's a worse movie than most people remember.
Yeah. But it's not even that. It's just like the care. Like I don't want to like be mean to Star Wars people, but even the characters, they hold no interest for me at all. Okay, they're so. I think it's because it's so the filmmaking is so derivative, in a way that doesn't in any way challenge or forward anything new. It's just,
well, it's basically a remake of the first Star Wars movie.
Yeah, and Star Wars is
with
basically
teddy bears.
Yeah, those things are fucking creepy. I just what but even the first Star Wars is like a retelling of like 1930s serial, right? Both Spielberg and Lucas always did that. They loved those Flash Gordon.
Well, they brought them together with Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, they love those kind of Tintin, all that stuff, right? Like those they grew up with that, right? And it's all nostalgic and whatever. Anyway, my point is, there are movies that I find that people love, and I find them brutal to get through, right? And these are just like you're straight ahead. I can't watch. I don't know. Do you find this like as you get older, especially? Like, how can you? I can't watch regular movies like Knives Out or something, right? Like, I'm sure it's fine.
Knives Out was a Mongrel Media release.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not gonna
include. Well, I don't want to talk about one of my own films that much. Actually, I really like Knives Out, but I find and my son loves Star Wars so much that his growing up, I rewatched all the Star Wars movies multiple times.
Yeah.
And I have a very complicated relationship with Star Wars, which would be a great podcast on its own.
Okay, we'll do that one next.
I'll talk about Star Wars a lot.
Okay.
And I don't love Star Wars.
Okay.
So.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
But because I love film so much, I do try to, and because of what I do for a living, I do try to watch current mainstream stuff as much as I can as well. And I also have kind of an affinity for horror films, so I try to watch a lot of horror films. And I think it's important to, when you look at something and you can't get into it, try to find something you can. And that's hard. It's hard with Return of the Jedi, for sure.
Yeah, it's really hard with that one. But
it's hard for most Marvel. Like, the superhero genre, I have very little patience for.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched most of the superhero movies, like the Marvel stuff. None of them are terrible. I mean, I haven't seen all of them, but they're fine. But they're.
What does that mean, though? What does fine mean?
Fine means that exactly. I mean, really, they're just a way to waste time. Yeah, just to kind of like. they're fun to sit if you're sitting with your kid or you're with some people and you're just like, it's a popcorn movie.
You
right?
can spend 3.5 hours watching Avengers Endgame, or you can spend 3.5 hours watching Jeanne Dielman.
Yeah.
Watch Jeanne Dielman.
But see, the thing is, here's the other thing about this poll and everything, right? Part of the problem for me, and this is what I was talking about with my skepticism, is now that you've done this, right? Like they've made Jeanne Dielman the greatest film of all time. It has a kind of double-edged sword quality to it, right? Number one, it now becomes an elitist, canonized piece that people are going to be very resistant toward because it's being considered the greatest film of all time, and I'm too stupid to get it, and it's not for me. That's why I'm trying to push this idea that it's actually a lot of fun to watch, and it's not fun, maybe the wrong word, but it's engrossing, right?
It is very engrossing. It goes back to the idea that these canonical films are like homework, or you're studying cinema, or you have to be smarter, or you have to have some kind of education in film cinema. And you don't.
No.
Every person has their own relationship to a certain film.
Yeah.
That is different. And this is part of why I think Jeanne Dielman has been ranked so high at number one, is because as Sight and Sound magazine expanded the number of people that they were polling, it went much more diverse. And it's not just about the diversity, it's about how the critical industry of film comment and criticism has moved online. So you have a wider number of people from different walks of life contributing to the conversation. So it's not just film critics who work for newspapers who are going to come from a certain socioeconomic background.
Sure.
You've got people who have gotten by on the talent of the writing, even if it's just been through online journalism and film writing. And so you've got different points of view. And even somebody like me or Azed, who, as I mentioned earlier, learned about cinema through the old-fashioned canon of white male Hollywood directors, you've got a whole group of people now who are learning of it through different ways. And they're also learning about film online. So through streaming services, through websites where they had access to films that, I didn't have access to when I was learning about cinema in the 1990s.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure even if we went on YouTube right now, we could find one of those Jeanne Dielman intensity, like you know what I mean? Like it's a different universe, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And people just who had heard of it,
yeah.
Right? I mean, again, I work in the industry. I'm a huge movie buff, and I had never seen it.
And
that's ridiculous.
I only saw it when it came because I only saw it a couple of years ago. Pandemic, Criterion Channel. Yeah. There you go.
There's
right?
another thing about when you look at the top 100 lists that came out from Sight and Sound this year. There's so many new films on there that you wonder, had people have seen these films, had it not even been for the pandemic, what about that? So, for example, I was having a conversation with my girlfriend earlier today, and she's not a huge movie buff. She's never seen Jeanne Dielman, but I was telling her about this podcast that was on and why I wanted to talk about it. And she just looked at me and went, well, maybe it scored so highly just because of the pandemic, because she's a woman in an apartment.
Yeah, I think that could have something to do with it.
That's interesting.
I do think whether that's the reason or not, I'm not sure. But
there's no one reason, but yeah.
Yeah, but I do think the woman in an apartment will resonate with people more now that we have been through lockdowns, right?
Sure.
Like I think in some ways that this experience of having the pandemic lockdowns has really brought that home to everybody, right? The idea of being sort of isolated, and cut off, from the large world. I mean, we do see her a few times walking the streets, going to get groceries, and actually, Laura Mulvey did write about this recently. Yeah. And for anybody who, I mean, this sounds like who's Laura Mulvey, right? But for anybody who studied any film at all, I think Laura Mulvey is a very well-known,
very important feminist film critic.
She was the one who popped. I mean, I see this all the time now with with millennial Twitter things and whatever. It's like,
wow, you sound old now.
I am a totally old man, especially with this hoarse voice, right? But it's like people will talk about the male gaze, right? Oftentimes not really understanding, I think, what that actually
get it wrong
means. Yeah, but that whole thing got really popularized by Laura Mulvey, right? In her, really important essay she did in the 70s called Sexual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema.
Right.
Right. And it's interesting because it's related to, and I think this is what she was writing about with Jeanne Dielman becoming the greatest film of all time, is it's one of the first, I would say probably one of the most successful attempts to displace the male gaze. Because if you want to get into what the male gaze is, it's really about the whole ideological apparatus that creates the look, right? It's not just about the gendered subject in the audience watching. It's about the entire apparatus, like basically ways of seeing, right? That are masculinized under a patriarchal rubric, right? So, for years, a lot of feminist theorists have been talking about, well, how do we displace that male gaze? Is it possible, right? Because if you're in it, even your attempt to be out of it is part of it, right?
Right. It's a reaction to it.
It's a reaction to it. So it simultaneously tries to destroy it, but also upholds it, right? But with Jeanne Dielman, there is that focused look that is so focused, right, that it highlights the gaze in a way that makes you self-conscious, right, of the look. But secondarily, it's not like it's not as simple as Akerman is just saying, "Oh, poor woman, poor housewife, blah 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 blah." There's something loving in the look.
Very much so.
It's like, and I read this our interview with Akerman that said that this was really a lot about her mother, right? Like she had a single, a single mom, and she worshipped her, right? And she would look at her, and if you notice, this is also a very Ozu thing in the movie, but if you notice, the camera is often at a child's perspective, right?
Yeah.
And it's because that way she was always watching her mother, she said.
Just slightly elevated.
Slightly elevated, but yeah,
almost imperceptibly.
You can see it's a low angle, right? And there's a loving quality to a child watching their mother prepare the dinner, for example, especially for a young girl, I would have to imagine, especially a young girl like Chantal Akerman, who was gay and came out early, and her movies were a lot about that and about gender and all that kind of stuff. I think it's interesting because this is also a bit of a sidebar, but it comes to mind. Akerman actually committed suicide about just pre-pandemic, I think, right?
I'm not sure when.
Yeah, a few years ago. And her surviving, I think, sister said that Akerman's mother had died a few years before that, and she was never the same. And her last movie was about her mother.
Right.
Because her mother was a Holocaust survivor.
Okay.
And never, ever talked about it.
Interesting.
And Akerman became very interested in her Jewish roots in her later years as well. And I think there was something there where she both loved and admired her mother and was very attached.
Knowing that adds so many layers to the film.
It does, yeah.
Her economy of being.
Yeah.
Jeanne Dielman's economy of turning off the lights all the time.
Right.
The way she has, the routine of dinner time. She mentions that, Wednesday is veal day or something like that.
Right.
So clearly, her and her son not only do the same things every day, but they have the exact same meals on certain days of the week.
Right.
And I guess that's really interesting that it sort of that informs that character to a large degree. That psychology.
Exactly. That World War II frugality.
And
right?
the admiration of that.
Yeah. And also the strength, because there is something strong about Jeanne Dielman, right? As much as she's kind of seen as a domestic, hostage in some ways, there's something, this is the fascinating thing about it. There's something that she owns very, very much about her rituals. Mm-hmm. They're hers, and she doesn't seem to be, she has a very placid face all the time. Not one of like being harried or like hurried, or
she doesn't look like she's suffering,
not like she's suffering or she's stressed or anything, right? Nor does she look necessarily happy, but she just looks kind of content or at peace, right? And I think it is that idea again of the rituals of everyday life can sometimes, not sometimes, probably most of the time, do act as a kind of buffer to the dark nights of the soul that we might go through, right? And we all go through them. And how do we get through our day, right? With all this roiling
Which
stuff,
I think, again, since the pandemic, we've all really been face to face with.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I would encourage everyone listening, if you have not seen this film, you will find it more relatable and more engrossing than you think it will.
That's exactly what I want to push too, because it's a hard sell, like you said, right? It's a really hard sell to get someone to watch this. I've talked to a few people who are like, you're braver than I am, or whatever. And I'm like, if
you can sit through Avengers Endgame, you can sit through this.
I know, because there's, this is the old junk food analogy, right? Like, okay, everybody likes the taste of junk food, sure. But don't try to tell me it's good for me, because it's not, right?
Well, what kills me in the streaming age is people going, "Oh my God, this movie is 3 hours long," and then the next day they'll sit and they'll binge, Game of Thrones for like 5 hours. It's like,
Of course, yeah, I know. Like,
why? I don't get it.
It's all about the way things are branded, right? And that's what I was getting at with this, oh, you're the best film of all, like there's like almost like this quality of, it's homework, like you were saying earlier, right? And this is the kind of thing that it's hard to get people to understand, because everybody loves movies, right? But we categorize movies into these particular sections that don't make a lot of sense. And this is one thing about them, making it the greatest film of all time that is very progressive, right? Is that it's taking a movie that's been ghettoized into like experimental land, right? And bringing it now into the canon of, great cinema that we like, according to the old canon, right? And they're bringing in this interloper in a way that's going to now hopefully change things. The thing that I fear, and the things we're both kind of seem to be pushing, right, is nobody's going to watch it, right?
No.
And then it'll be like, have you seen the greatest film of all time? I've never even heard of it. You know what I mean?
Temporary. It's so relevant. It hasn't...
Now let's talk a little bit about Daphne Seyrig, right? Like...
Delphine Seyrig, yeah.
Delphine Seyrig, sorry. Very kind of well-known French actress.
Well, her breakout was Last Year at Marienbad.
Yes. Right. She was in last year, another big art house film. She was in
India Song.
India Song. So she was in some movies, yes, that were Marguerite Duras. Right. So she was kind of this well-known French actress of artsy, more kind of upscale art movies, right? And she is just perfect in this movie. The performance is nuts. Like I'm like, holy fuck. Because, okay, you see if you agree with me. Like, I'm very attracted to her, right? And I mean that from probably a male perspective, but also just as a person, right? Like, there's something about her performance that's so subtle, right? Like, it's understated to the point where you start to feel this empathy for her, and it's the way she looks, her sweater, the whole thing.
Well, we've talked about how as the film progresses, things seem to break down a little bit by bit by bit, and it's almost imperceptible. But again, the film style and the long shots and the length of time that the film runs keeps you so engrossed that you start to notice the subtle shifts in her performance that indicate to you that she's breaking down a bit.
Right.
And it's an incredibly precise artistry that she somehow does. Seyrig's performance is luminous and it's hypnotic, and it's very slight gradations until you get to the very end where, you know, that last shot where she's sitting at the table.
Yeah.
And
with the bloody hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, it's interesting. I mean, I don't care about a spoiler alert. It's ridiculous. But,
yeah.
Okay, so at the end of the movie, so we've talked about how there's 3 days. She's a prostitute, as you know, as well as all this other stuff she does. But that's how, obviously, she's making her money, right? Or not. That's not fully clear.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just something she does, right? But whatever it is, it's very mechanical. The third time she goes in, you go in the room with her, and her trick, her John, right?
And as they're sleeping together, the camera's on them. He's on top of her. She's facing up. We see her face.
Yeah.
And she is going through these waves of, is it pleasure? Is it discomfort? Is she nauseous?
Yeah.
Is she resisting? Is she having an orgasm? It's all meshed together in a way that is...
It does seem like all of those things to a certain extent. Like, I mean, I think she's definitely having an orgasm, and I think she doesn't like it that she's having an orgasm.
No.
Right?
No.
This is what I was saying earlier. We were talking about the second John she has, the second trick, when you don't go in and see it, but you see her hair is messy and stuff. And you realize in retrospect, okay, these guys are giving her pleasure. She doesn't want to be given pleasure because that takes her control away.
And now, you know, at first I thought that he had done something awful to her.
I thought so too, like overly rough or something. Yeah.
But by the end of the film, I started questioning that. Of course, you don't know because you're never in the room when she's with her second client.
Right.
But you start to realize that it could be the pleasure of it and the hatred of that pleasure.
Yeah, and it's not the pleasure per se.
Right.
It's the fact that it's something out of her control.
Right.
When she's able to have sex with a John and not feel anything, that gives her a certain amount of
agency,
empowerment. Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right.
When it's taken, when she feels pleasure, it's actually where the worst breakdown comes because her autonomy is gone, right? And of course, then what happens after that is she stabs the guy, right, in the neck.
She kills him,
right? And in a very matter-of-fact way, right? It's just like...
There's no dramatic music.
Nothing.
There's no
she just
close-up.
Walks over. It's in the mirror. You see it reflected in the mirror where she's like combing her hair first at her vanity or whatever, her mirror.
While he's lying there.
And he's just kind of staring at her in a weird way. And then she just walks over very quietly and stabs him in the neck, right? Or whatever. And that's the end of the movie, basically, after she sits at the table. Yeah. But, and it can seem very confusing at first, but it is all about that concept of being so imprisoned within your own life that the only control you have is over these things.
And maybe we've all known people like that. I think I have.
I've known myself to be like that. Honestly, I've definitely had times like that. Like, I'm not saying, it's not the same as being a woman, obviously, at that time. But I think we can relate to that feeling of feeling trapped in your own life, where you feel powerless to do anything. And therefore, the small things that you do have control over become very important to you, right? Yeah. Because that's the only place where you have a sense of a voice, right? And ironically, she doesn't. It's ironic because she doesn't speak a lot, right?
She says so much though in her performance, just her face.
she's just incredible.
Her
Like,
body, just
yeah, and
movements.
she's very beautiful too. Like, but again, she's not in any way made up to be beautiful,
No.
right? But she's just a beautiful woman, right? And I think Akerman was very aware of that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That there's something about her that's alluring. It's completely convincing that she's doing the prostitution, right? And I wonder if this is just for the male perspective, if my watching it, whatever. But I did feel sexually attracted to her as a character, right? That wasn't the overall, feeling, but there was definitely like, oh yeah.
Well, that's
sexy.
part of what the audience is going to have a relationship with.
Yeah.
And of course, you did not only feel
No.
attracted to her, you empathize with her. And again, going back to the idea that yes, this is a 3.5 hour avant-garde film, but believe us, this is an emotionally accessible, engrossing film, and you will empathize and relate to this character.
Now, do you think this is the start of something, like where we're going to see more films like this one, like obscure works of genius that like were seen by like 10 people before, and now are gonna, because has this opened the door? Do you think, or do you think this is like
It
a
being
one-off?
number one on the list, opening the door.
Yeah, opening the door just for more like. I mean, there were other movies that were on this list that were not on before, right?
A lot
of them, and a lot of them were really questionable, I have to say, because they had to remove some too, and they removed some amazing
That's
ones.
a whole great conversation about what they took off, what they put back on, what's going on.
Exactly, what's going on. But I mean, like, is this a good thing? I mean, this is what we're sort of saying. Like, are we going to move to a new kind of canon here, right? Where, I mean, we already have. Yeah.
I think I agree that there are films I would not agree should be on a top 100 list, and as I've said before, my favorite movie of all time will never be on this list. And I don't know why not. It's Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life.
That's an amazing movie.
Of course it's an amazing film, but I know it will never be on this list. It does not
That's
carry,
the branding thing, yeah.
It's the branding thing. It is not a critical darling in today's world.
Right.
And we, when you look at the films that there's notable films that I think were added that I'm really happy about. Do the Right Thing.
Right.
Would be one.
I agree.
The Apartment.
Oh yeah, I love The Apartment.
So, we talked, one thing we noticed is that
Apartment hadn't been on before.
Not in the top 100, no.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I think it's interesting how so many films that were dropped off were kind of old school Hollywood filmmakers, but a few that added, like The Apartment. And of course, newer films were added too. So Goodfellas, for example.
Right. Which
Parasite.
Yeah, that's a bit iffy for me. I mean, I like Parasite, but I don't know. It's a very tough thing. Because
Parasite's a tough one for me because, like you, I don't love the film.
Right.
But again, being part of this industry, I remember when it premiered at Cannes, and it just completely blew
people away.
People away.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just us, Azed.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
We're just out of touch, man.
No. Let's face it. I like Parasite. I think it's a good movie. It's a fine movie, right? But it has a lot of problems, right?
Yeah.
And it's a little sloppy. So my feeling is, it's fine, and I can appreciate, I could totally appreciate somebody trying something and not quite hitting the mark, right? That can be a very admirable thing, and you can enjoy a movie on that level. This one, like Parasite, it does not belong on this list, right? I feel the same way.
I would agree.
I feel the same way about Get Out, which I like a lot. It's a good movie. Does not belong on this list for me.
That I disagree with.
Well, I mean,
Get Out is to my mind one of the absolute greatest horror films of all time. And this speaks to another problem I have with this list overall, and the whole idea of a canon
of course,
the exclusion of genre films. and
Right.
and how there's very few horror films on this list, very few science fiction films, very
Right.
few crime dramas, really.
Right. It's
And-
still got that. That's what's interesting about this though, because this is Jeanne Dielman is not your typical canon film,
No.
and certainly not the one to be number one. Right. So I think what we're going to start seeing is this is like the younger film buffs out there and critics and filmmakers are going to start going like this. And it's not starting. This is old, but like the idea of a canon that's, yeah, like sure these movies are all great, but it's like it's all men. It's all the same
Sure.
10 great directors, right? And
Yeah.
like fuck that. Like let's just get some new things in
And
here.
you even
right?
look at films that have dropped lower on the list but are still on there, like The Searchers, for example.
right,
Which often considered the greatest Western ever made.
right.
Often has appeared up high in the top 10-ish.
Right.
Now it's much lower, which I don't disagree with. I think The Searchers is there's racist elements to it that back in my 20s, I thought The Searchers was like the greatest thing I'd ever seen.
Right.
Now I can think of Westerns that I appreciate more than that,
Yeah, I think
personally.
I love The Searchers, love it, and I think that it's about racism. Like that's
100%.
Yeah,
It's what makes it difficult. It's about racism. Obviously, the Ethan Edwards character, the John Wayne character, is a racist, and that's condemned in the text of the film.
Right.
But there are elements of the subtext and elements that I don't think are deliberate, where it is quite racist. And
yeah, that I agree with you.
which is kind of hard. It's
Yeah,
probably hard for John Ford in the 1950s to avoid.
Yeah, I think
But-
I think yeah. I know what you mean. Like, I mean, you might even say there was another John Ford film that I like even more, which is My Darling Clementine,
Sure.
right? Which is again like it also has some nascent, homoerotic stuff going on in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was it conscious? Probably not, right? But it's there, and you can see it. Same with The Searchers. It's like, it's always the greatest films are always those ones that has a tension between the zeitgeist of the time, right, and the strange eccentricities of the director or writers or whatever, especially the director,
Of course, yeah.
right, and that tension is there in the movie, right. That's why it's not okay to just condemn, because you're old white,
No.
Hollywood filmmaker. Okay. I understand the anger there, but you know what? It's like those movies are great for a reason, because a lot of times those guys were trying to get shit in through the cracks.
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know?
when I look at some important films that were dropped off the list completely,
Yeah, like Touch of Evil,
Touch of Evil,
which is brilliant.
absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
But you've got Charlton Heston and Brownface.
Yeah, playing Mexican. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia, which I would put in my top 10 list any day.
Yeah, it's a pretty great movie.
Also, a lot of white British actors in Brownface.
Yes.
So that could be, I could see a lot of people
Yeah.
going, you know what? Sure, I can appreciate its great qualities,
But we don't
I'm
need it.
just not into
Yeah,
it.
let's just leave it off. Yeah.
But I was surprised to see Raging Bull drop off the list.
That doesn't make sense,
any sense to
especially
me.
when you put Goodfellas in its place, which Goodfellas is excellent, but
Yeah.
Raging Bull is come on, man. Like,
But why? Is it because it's a portrait of this?
it's so elegant. Like, one of the
No,
things,
why is it dropped off?
Yeah.
Is what I'm asking. Is
Yeah.
it because he's such a
'cause
horrible
he's
person?
a domestic abuser. Yeah, he's a tough.
I would never put Taxi Driver in my top 100 in a million years. I am not a fan of Taxi Driver. So
I would say, well, it's funny that you use Taxi Driver and The Searchers because they're kind of the same movie. Yeah, but no, but like I don't understand that one either.
And I think filmmakers also fall out of fashion. Did you know that 3 films by Ingmar Bergman dropped off the list from last year? 3.
He's definitely passé. Like,
Not to me, but to a
not
lot
to
of
me
people.
either. Not to me either. Although I do understand it to a certain extent. Like, my favorite film of all time is Persona.
Sure.
Right? Because it was the movie that I saw as a young man that turned me from like watching like Risky Business into like other, a little bit better movies. Although Risky Business is
Side
fine.
note, Risky Business is
It
really
is
good,
very
yeah.
good. Yes, it is. It is. But yeah, like there are things about those kinds of, like, I did see, what was it? Cries and Whispers, couple of years ago. To me, it didn't hold up as well.
Okay.
You know, I still
That's
liked
never
it.
been my favorite Bergman.
Yeah, it's true. It's not my favorite.
Another famous Bergman that's never been my favorite is Virgin Spring. I've never been a big fan of that one. But, you know.
That's pretty good.
But
You
Seventh
know.
Seal dropped off the list.
Right.
Wild Strawberries dropped off the list.
Okay.
I mean, that's crazy.
Seventh
me.
Seal, okay, that's interesting, because Seventh Seal, I don't love it. I mean, of course, the iconic, you know.
Well, the influence of it is
Yeah, the
incredible.
chest, you know, with death kind of thing. But, the whole, it's not my favorite by a long shot of his. Virgin Spring, I thought, was actually pretty good. Didn't Wes Craven make a remake of that?
Yes, The Last House on the Left.
Last House on the Left, right.
One of the more notorious of the 70s
Yeah.
shocking horror films.
It's greasy. Yeah.
It is super greasy.
It's super greasy. Yeah. That's the thing. That's the thing about horror films like that from the 70s. They're so, like, they're super oily. You have to take a shower.
Oh, side note, I thought I would do my kid a favor, who's now into horror movies.
Right.
On Halloween night, after we went to the zombie apocalypse Casa Loma experience, I thought, okay, we're going to crown this with one of the greats, Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Oh, my God.
And he hates me. Like, he's just like,
Wow.
deep trauma.
That is really
Deep
bad.
trauma.
Yeah. I mean,
Masterpiece.
I
but-
can't. Yeah, you know what? That's true. It is a masterpiece. I never want to see it again, ever. It was a super traumatic experience for me too.
I would put that on my top 100.
It's a pretty
I would
brilliant.
put-
It's a pretty brilliant film.
I would put a
yeah.
lot more genre films on my top one. I would.
That's a good point. Yeah.
That's one thing I think is really like Rio Bravo dropped off the list.
Wow.
You know,
Wow.
that one Howard Hawks film dropped off.
Wow. That's funny because that was Robin Wood's favorite movie of all time. You know. Anyway. My point. None of those movies.
And he had a lot to say about 1970s horror as well, which was
He was very big on kind of bringing 70s
stuff
horror
like,
into a kind of more.
It's Alive. I think he wrote a lot about.
Yeah,
and
like
Larry Cohen films.
Yeah, and I love Larry
Dawn
Cohen.
of the Dead. Yeah.
Dawn of the Dead. Yeah, and he wrote from a very ideological perspective, so you know he was really getting into like what these movies were really about, right? And I think the whole concept of the return of the repressed as the monster, that comes from a Robin. I mean, it comes from Freud, but Robin brought it in, right? Yeah. I mean, and in many ways, I think in many ways, it's interesting that we're talking about horror because there is something about the horror structure in Jeanne Dielman as well, right? Like just in the way that the return of the repressed, right? The thing that's being repressed then visits with this kind of horrific violence.
Horror.
It's a little bit like a monster movie in that sense, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of psycho-ish. You've got the
little
young
bit.
teenager kind of, I mean, I'm stretching here.
No, I think
Big
that's
time,
that's a cool take, man. Like I get that completely. Like it's there is, in a way, that's the another really fascinating thing about this movie is it's multi-genred, right? Like
really
it doesn't, it defies a category. It has all the Hitchcock suspense stuff in it, like we were talking about, but it's not like that kind of a movie. It's got a bit of that kind of horror element because of the creeping kind of like dread you're feeling it throughout the movie.
Nerve-wracking.
Yeah, and then it comes to this kind of climax, right? And then it's got like the feminist film kind of thing, and
it's really a canvas you can paint a lot onto.
In many ways I think I kind of agree that it is the greatest film ever made.
God, look where we've come.
Wow. It's hard because you resist it so hard because of what we were talking about the way you're raised and taught in this canon.
Yeah.
It's got to be a man. It's got to be Hitchcock. It's got to be John Ford. It's got to be whoever. Even though with this one the resistance is okay, it's great, but it doesn't belong in number one. Well, I think it does belong at number one.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think in some ways it's much better than those movies because it's you'll never forget this movie.
No.
It'll come into your head.
It will stay with you.
It'll come into your head forever. Yeah. Like you'll think about things, you'll remember those
And you'll
scenes.
see other films differently,
Yeah.
I think.
So in that sense, it's for me, one of the biggest things about any art form, I think if you're into any art form, you know, dance or music or whatever, writing, one of the things you look for more than anything else is not just well-made stuff, but, you know, a piece that's going to push the actual art form into new directions, right? Something that hadn't been seen prior, a brand new style, right?
Yeah, and speaking for myself, I find I've seen so many films, and I've been doing this for all my life, that it's almost irrelevant if I quote unquote like something.
Absolutely.
I want to see something that's different,
Yeah.
that's gonna do something where I go, okay, maybe it didn't totally work, but that part was interesting.
Yeah.
And this made me think of this in a different way.
Yeah, because like
You know?
I like it, I don't like it. I mean, there are many reasons why you like I love
And it
all
changes,
kinds of
too.
shitty movies.
Sure.
Because I grew like, you know, if you were a kid and you watched like whatever, like you know, I can only think of John Hughes, 16 Candles, you know, then, you know, maybe you still like it.
Well,
you
we
know?
all, you know, like for me, like It's a Wonderful Life it means something to me, right? And my relationship with that film has changed a lot over the years since I
Right.
became a father.
Yeah.
You know, as I've grown up and become, you know, professional.
Right.
As opposed to when I first loved the movie when I was like a late teens, early 20s.
Right.
And I think we all go through times in our lives where we might find certain films, like for example, you know, the last winner of this award was Vertigo. Now in my 20s, Vertigo was my favorite Hitchcock film.
Yep.
And it is no longer my favorite Hitchcock film. And you know, and in fact, when it was awarded the number one, I was like, you know, people would say, well, do you think it's the greatest movie ever made? And I'd be like, well, not only is it not the greatest movie ever
It's not
made,
even the greatest
it's not even
Hitchcock
Hitchcock's greatest movie.
Right.
You know, so, you know, I think everything changes in our lives that makes us
Yeah, where you
feel
are.
differently about certain films at different times. And going back to the idea that maybe the pandemic helped shape critical thinking when after 2 years of lockdown, you get a note from a magazine saying, hey, well, give me your top 10 films of all time. Well, maybe Jeanne Dielman pops in there when it wouldn't have, you know, 3 years ago.
Yeah. I think what you were saying, though, what ultimately kind of earlier, I mean, you were saying this about an experience, right? A film that gives you an experience of some kind. And I think for people like us especially, we're very attuned to that because what other people consider sometimes an experience is just like what Scorsese said about Marvel, which is like, you know, it's like a roller coaster ride. It's an amusement park ride, right? And so many times these days you hear like about the death of cinema and like nobody's going to the cinema. And I'm sure, you know, obviously
every day
it's true, right? It's your job. But, you know, we really want, in some ways, this is a very radical move to put Jeanne Dielman as the greatest film of all time, which we're both saying we agree with. And
I'm not.
Okay, well, I say I agree with it. I do. I agree with it on many levels. It's a great film. I think I'm going to learn to appreciate it even more. I have a desire to watch it again.
Me too.
Right.
Ever since I first saw it, I wanted to, you know, remember after the movie, I wanted to sit with you and Ishi and go,
I know.
like, we gotta like talk for like 3 hours.
Yeah, I know. So, you know, it's like, I think I'm going to, you know, it's going to improve every time I watch it.
Yeah.
But beyond that, there's a political side to this whole thing, which we've talked about, right? And that idea of opening up the canon, just breaking down those old barriers. I'm not for like, let's shit on, John Ford's grave. I'm not for that stuff, right? But yeah, okay, move down, you know? Like, this is right. Like, there's a lot of shit like this out there. I think another movie that was on the list was Daisies, right?
Daisies, yes.
Which is also
I've never seen it.
Oh, it's great. You'll love it. You'll love it. It's different. It's a lot more wacky.
Right.
And, definitely more new agey, new wave kind of style thing. But it's great. You'll love it. But my point being that there's a lot of great movies like that I hope come into the onto the list and then also come into the top 10. You know
I
what
would
mean?
say for anybody listening who has more than a passing interest in cinema and wants to deep dive into some interesting things but doesn't know where to begin, taking a look at this list and just like jumping into it and just seeing stuff that jumps out at you or going through it you can't go wrong. I mean, even if you don't necessarily like everything that you see, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be something that is going to. I don't think there's not a terrible movie on there. I'm not a big fan of The Shining, but that's me.
No, I love The Shining, but there are too many Kubrick movies on there, I think.
What?
This is another because there's 2001, there's The Shining, there's Barry Lyndon, there's
so what's wrong with any of that?
Is Clockwork Orange on there?
I don't think so.
There's another. I think there's another one. Paths of Glory.
No, maybe Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove, right?
I mean, can you really argue top 100 those four? Come on.
Well, I certainly wouldn't take Barry Lyndon.
I would switch out a Bergman. Put it that way.
Oh yeah. Okay. I'd have to.
We should have trading cards.
Yes, we should. Oh, good idea.
I'll trade you 2 days.
Let's spend a lot of money and time on that, and wind up crying on the street. All right. Well, that was a really great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Too. I hope you all enjoyed it as well.
Yes, and go out and try to find Jeanne Dielman. I'm sure you can find it on Canopy, probably. Any of your library sort of streaming services, or just go to the library. I'm sure they have it. If you don't have the Criterion channel, I would recommend the Criterion channel. I mean, I get that people don't want to get it because they're not going to watch it all that often, but I don't know. I do too, but
But I also buy Blu-rays, so
right. But
not everyone does that.
You know what? Hey, if you really want to see it, give us a call. We'll set up a screening night for you. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. And until next time.
See you out there in the dark.